All right, everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Influx Waver and the Terra Blade, or the comparison between the two items, I suppose I should say. These have always been kind of like the two later hard mode swords, aside from Meowmere and Star's Wrath, which you get after beating Moonlord and Zenith, which wasn't released until 1.4. But the relationship between the two has always kind of been like they're both very solid melee weapons, as solid as melee could be, I guess, even though I think it was considered probably the weakest class ahead of Summoner. But the Influx Waver was always considered to be slightly stronger than the Terra Blade. At least I think that was the main perception, which makes sense because the Terra Blade is obtained after you defeat Terra, where then solar eclipses will spawn and you can farm broken hero swords and then create the Terra Blade with the true Knight's Edge and true Excalibur, where the Influx Waver you obtain after you defeat Golem, at which point you can find the Martian probes that spawn in space and summon a Martian invasion, where you get the Influx Waver by defeating the boss, the Martian saucer. But with 1.4.4, a lot of big changes were brought, including changes to both of these weapons, which left me wondering, is the relationship still the same? Because I'm not sure. Basically, what they both did before is that they were both just swords that when you swung them, they shot a projectile beam. And the Influx Waver still does this, as you can see. It also has a secondary effect, which I won't show here, but I will have footage of the boss fights that I've tested the weapons on in a corner or like laid somewhere or placed somewhere on the screen where you can see what it does. But the Terra Blade, while it used to do a similar thing, now does something completely different, as I'm sure many of you know, probably almost all of you know, because the Terra Blade has been one of the mainstream things when it comes to content regarding the new update. So I'll just read the changes for each of the items, just, you know, for a refresh. The Terra Blade basically just got a full rework. The damage was reduced by 30 and the use time was increased, so it swings slower. The Terra Blade has an area of damaging energy around the blade, which just basically increases the melee range in like all aspects, like the hitbox. Oops, I don't know what I just did. The hitbox of the weapon was massively increased. And then instead of a projectile sword beam, it shoots this big green slash that you just saw and that you've seen many times before. Whereas the Influx Waver stayed mostly the same. It still shoots its sword projectile, which you saw, and it did get a buff. The damage was reduced by 10, while the secondary projectiles that are spawned after a successfully landed projectile hit now move with their target, significantly reducing the chance of missing. So the issue with the Influx Waver, in some capacity at least, was that the secondary projectiles that it creates upon hitting an enemy were actually missing the target, which reduced the damage that it did. And so these changes really made me think, like, which one of these is actually the better weapon now? Because I think that the unanimous consensus among most players is that the Terra Blade is nuts, and the changes, you know, it does less damage, like, on paper, kinda, but everything about the Terra Blade is so much easier to use. It's just way simpler to apply. It doesn't have this awkward, like, thin sword beam that you have to hit, which the Influx Waver still has, and I still think is an issue with the consistency of the item, because you have to hit this projectile on, like, fast-moving bosses and enemies, whereas the Terra Blade, you just have this gigantic wave of damage, and the weapon itself is also massive. It's strange on paper, regardless, because if you just take a look at, like, me testing these dummies out, if I'm hitting all the dummies with the Influx Waver, I'm doing like up to 5,000 DPS with the setup that I have, which you can see over here. The projectile that it shoots doesn't do much. It's a single target only sort of thing, which also is a weird application comparison between the two, because the Terra Blade's big green wave of energy pierces infinitely, and, you know, I mean, the base damage that it does massively outdamages the Influx Waver. It's doing like up to 2,000 more damage per second against all these dummies, because you can hit more of them because the melee hitbox is bigger, and then the wave just pierces all of them, as opposed to the Influx Waver. But the Influx Waver is still, can sort of hold its own, as you may be able to see in the footage that I've been placing on the screen. It still holds its own because of the secondary projectile effect, which will just, put extra hits on the enemies. So it's very strange. Like I kind of have already said, it's not as cut and dry as just like the Influx Waver is slightly better because it has this extra effect, even if it like has always swung a little slower, I think, and does a little bit less. No, that's not true. I think it definitely does more base damage now. I think it was probably more comparable before, because the Terra Blade's damage got reduced by like, a lot more. But it just seems that like the Influx Waver is very strong still. It may even do more damage, although it's hard to tell. In the boss fights that I tested the weapons on, they seemed very close in damage. But when I stop and think about it, I'm like, the Influx Waver is good against these single targets, but it's still just so much harder to use against like fast moving enemies and smaller hitboxes, and nowhere near as good against larger groups of enemies, I would imagine, because the Terra Blade just covers more space in all ways. But yeah, since I was doing stuff with the Terra Blade for like a video, I was like, I should actually check this out, because this was something I was curious about, the comparison between the two weapons. And still, I'm not sure. I feel like the Terra Blade is legitimately just a better weapon than the Influx Waver, even though the Influx Waver is supposed to be stronger. I feel like the Influx Waver, it's kind of like, it's a more ancient weapon, I guess, right? Like the Terra Blade got modernized to sort of fit with a lot of the other melee weapons that have come out in more recent years, while the Influx Waver is still stuck with its awkward little sword projectile beam. But both weapons are still good, right? You can still use both of them. I think that the Terra Blade was just completely modernized and is an insane weapon. You can just use this for anything in all modes. And the Influx Waver maybe just kind of catching up to the power that it needs to be to actually function in Master Mode, which is where I assume it might have been lacking a little bit, because I think melee was kind of underpowered in general. And in Master Mode, where bosses do so much damage and move so quickly in later stages, it's just very hard to use something like the Influx Waver, at least in a consistent manner. So, got tuned up a little bit, which I think is great for both of the weapons. But yeah, that's going to be all for my little showcase of the comparison between these two items and their changes. Hopefully I went over anything. If anyone wants clarification on something, that I missed, leave it in the comments down below, and I would happily oblige. That will be all for the video today, though, and I shall see you in the next one.